Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to OBI's public talk on women's brain health. My name is Tom Mickelson. I'm the President and Scientific Director at the OBI. Many members of the OBI team, including myself, reside in the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, this meeting place is still home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples who remain caregivers of the land. So we're very grateful to have the opportunity to live and work here. So the OBI is a provincially funded non-for-profit. We work to accelerate the discovery of innovation, benefiting both patients and the economy. We were founded in 2010, and our vision is to position Ontario as a world leader in brain research, commercialization, and care. Our mission is to improve the lives of the 1 in 3 Canadians who are impacted by a brain disorder. Over the last 8 years, OBI has hosted 30 public talks featuring experts in neuroscience and brain health. The goal of these public talks is to educate, inform, and empower you with the knowledge about brain health, drawing from the latest advances in research and care. The topics of this year's talks were prioritized by you, our viewers and event attendees. You've joined us today for Women's Brain Health, the third of 4 events in this year's public talk series. So as you can imagine, this is a huge topic for the OBI team to tackle. We know that sex and gender differences keenly affect people living with brain disorders. And we do acknowledge that the diagnosis and treatment of neurodisorders does not offer a one-size-fits-all solution for women across the board. There are many factors to consider even within sex and gender: age, culture, socioeconomics, birth assignment, and roles within family and friend units, just to start. We won't be able to cover all aspects of brain health that touch women in this talk, but we're willing to have a frank discussion of how gendered experiences play out in the day-to-day management of neurologic conditions. Notably, epilepsy, traumatic brain injury, and concussion, and multiple sclerosis, and how certain disorders affect the lives of women as well as their loved ones. Before we hand things over to our panel, which will be expertly moderated by Rakib Tesfaye, I'd like to introduce a special guest who has graciously accepted our invitation to offer remarks. Lynn Poslins is the founder and president of Women's Brain Health Initiative. In 2021, she was appointed as a member of the Order of Canada for her contributions to research on women's cognitive health and aging through the founding of this initiative. Women's Brain Health Initiative has led various efforts to champion the need to explore sex and gender differences in women's brain health aging research, including creating the first research chair in women's brain health and aging, which is co-funded by OBI, and advocating for the Government of Canada to declare December 2nd as Women's Brain Health Day. As a member of the Canadian brain health community, OBI is very appreciative of the leadership and collaboration that Lynn and Women's Brain Health Initiative bring to the space. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Lynn Poslins to say a few words.
Thank you, Tom, and good evening. It's hard to believe that I founded Women's Brain Health Initiative just over 10 years ago. Since then, we have contributed to a profound shift in scientific thinking. Brain health disorders like Alzheimer's disease, stress, depression and anxiety, MS, and traumatic brain injury from intimate partner violence do not affect the sexes equally. So research must explore the differences between women and men. Women are more vulnerable to these types of disorders, but most research today still focuses on men. In fact, at the grassroots level of research, it is the male rat that's studied because the hormones in the female rat make it too complex. I also understand that we're quite aggressive when we're caged. That's why Women's Brain Health Initiative is so important. It is the only organization solely dedicated to protecting the brain health of women. We do this by funding sex and gender-based research that better meets women's needs. As one example, because of our efforts and the funding that we provide, along with support from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and OBI, Dr. Gillian Einstein is now the world's first research chair in women's brain health and aging. Women's Brain Health Initiative also shares the latest brain health scientific findings through our compelling preventative health education programs. So there is a greater understanding by the public about the best ways to maintain their cognitive vitality as they age. Now, an ever-increasing number of people recognize that dementia need not be inevitable. Rather, we can make certain lifestyle choices to help protect and preserve our brain health. Known as the 6 pillars of brain health, these lifestyle choices cumulatively can help all of us reduce our risk of cognitive decline. In case you're wondering, the 6 pillars of brain health are exercise, nutrition, social activity, stress reduction, mental stimulation, and sleep. Committing to new habits, though, is difficult for most of us. But with a habit tracker, it is easier to create and maintain the habits that can help you get and stay brain fit. So on December 2nd, in celebration of Women's Brain Health Day, a day that Tom has mentioned that we were instrumental in getting the Canadian government to declare annually on the National Health Calendar, we launched BrainFit, a unique habit tracking mobile app that focuses on all 6 pillars of brain health. This exciting new app monitors your progress, is private, secure, and confidential, and includes the latest evidence on how to optimize your brain health. Thanks to financial support from the Public Health Agency of Canada, BrainFit is available free of charge on Android and Apple, making it accessible to more people. Thank you for giving me the opportunity of sharing some of our work to combat brain aging disorders that disproportionately affect women. You have a wonderful and informative program ahead, so please sit back and enjoy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Rakib Tesfaye, and I will be your moderator this evening. Welcome to Women's Brain Health, the third OBI public talk in the Your Brain Health series. We are glad to have you joining us this evening. Today, our conversation will put a spotlight on brain disorders whose impact on women's health are not widely discussed or understood. This often results in women facing barriers and stigma when navigating healthcare choices and planning for their future. By centering the lived experience and professional expertise of our panelists, we will be discussing these barriers and the meaningful practices that can be implemented to support and empower women living with neurological conditions. Now, this talk may include discussions and topics of violence and discrimination. And so we acknowledge that this content may be difficult. So we encourage you to take care of your safety and well-being and check in with yourself during this talk. Now, we do have about 45 to 50 minutes to chat live with our panelists. So we will take as many questions as we can in that time that we have. So to send us your questions, you can use the chat function on the right side of your screen, or you can send us a direct message on our Twitter account @OntarioBrain, or you can email us at communications@braininstitute.ca. So let's introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Jenna Maldazzi, and she has lived with epilepsy, has lived experience with epilepsy, and is an advocate of epilepsy awareness as a member of the EPLINK Community Advisory Committee. By day, Jenna works as a digital marketing professional. Our second guest today is Dr. Sarah Morrow, and she's an associate professor in the Department of Clinical Neurological Sciences at Western University. And she's director of the London MS Clinic. Multiple sclerosis, MS, that's how we will be referring to it from now on. Sarah is also on the steering committee of the International MS Cognition Society and of the MS in the 21st Century, an international collaboration with the aim of defining how MS treatment and standard of care should look like. And last but not least, Lynn Haag is a PhD student, candidate, and a contract faculty member with the Faculty of Social Work at Wilfrid Laurier University, and a research trainee at the Acquired Brain Injury Research Lab at the University of Toronto. Lynn is exploring the gendered experiences of brain injury and the barriers and facilitating factors influencing mental health, return to work, and social integration encountered by brain-injured women survivors of intimate partner violence. She's also someone with lived experience of traumatic brain injury. So I'd like to start our talk off today with Jenna. Jenna, you've lived with epilepsy since childhood, and you've worked hard, as you've mentioned, to normalize it. What does this process look like throughout your life?
Hi, Rakib. That's a great question. It's been a messy process, I won't lie. It's been a lot of hard conversations with myself over the course of many years. And my relationship with my epilepsy has definitely changed since childhood, which I think is important context to give to properly answer your question. In grade school, when I was diagnosed, I didn't really have the vocabulary to talk to the adults around me about how I was feeling or if there was something wrong. And I didn't think that they would believe me either or think that I was making it up, which that's a message that a lot of girls and women hear on a regular basis and internalize, that we're making it up. We're being hysterical. It's not a big deal. Need to calm down, or it's all in your head. A lot of gaslighting from all different directions. And that's a message that I really carried with me into adulthood. I didn't know if people would believe me when I said that this was a factor. And so I rarely said anything. I acted like it didn't exist and tried to convince myself it wasn't real. And then as an adult, I lived kind of in this perpetual state of denial. I behaved as if it wasn't happening, that I didn't have epilepsy, and I planned my life and my routines really based on that denial. At the beginning of the presentation, one of our introductory videos mentioned the 6 pillars of brain health, and those were things I definitely wasn't doing at the time. And it eventually just got to the point for me where I think it was so exhausting to keep that up. It was having a really detrimental impact on my life and my health that I eventually decided that I needed to talk about it. And that was probably around 2010 or 2011 now. The process of normalizing it for me has been really hard work of trying to undo all the toxic dialogue that we as women internalize, that I'm not making this up. I'm not hysterical, that this is very real, and there are ways and mechanisms that I can do to cope with it. And taking kind of stock of my life and saying, these are the things that I can control. Epilepsy is not something I can control, but there are a lot of other mechanisms that I have now that can help me manage it and still have a good quality of life. So I think that process of normalizing it was really having to sit down and have that hard conversation with myself. I hope that other people who are listening who also have epilepsy know that that's a conversation that a lot of people are having. I know it's difficult and it may take a long time. In the case that took me a very long time as well. I think talking out about it and being vocal about it does help to normalize it for other people too.
Thank you so much, Jenna. And I'm going to now invite Sarah. And just to start off with a bit of context here, you've been working with women impacted by multiple sclerosis, MS, for years now, both in a research and clinic setting. Can you please tell us a little bit about the disease and the age at which women are typically diagnosed?
Absolutely. It is a women predominant disease, which is important to keep in mind, that it's about 3 to 4 women for every man who's diagnosed with MS. So this is really a women's disease. Not saying that men don't get it, of course, and they also have problems dealing with their MS and the symptoms they have, but it's a bit different when you're a woman dealing with these diseases because they're diagnosed in their 20s and 30s. So you're being diagnosed right around the time when you may be starting a career or starting a relationship or thinking about having a family or perhaps having had one child and thinking about adding to it. So you have to balance all the things that are stressful enough as a woman to then try and balance that with your MS diagnosis. The other part about MS that's very difficult is the unpredictability of it. So although we do have good treatments that prevent relapses, which are new symptoms that come on over hours to days and stay with you for a while before they improve, we don't have any cures. So this means that people with MS, and women specifically, are trying to balance being a mom and a wife, and also managing their MS while also managing their work and their career, while at the same time not knowing what's going to happen tomorrow. So that makes it really difficult. As Jenna was saying earlier, women really internalize that sense of responsibility and that need to live up to these expectations that's put on us in society. And I see that in my patients. They'll say, I just don't have the energy at the end of the day to look after my children or do the things I want to with my children. And yet they don't have that same ability to say, I need help, that perhaps men would, that they say, I've reached what I can do and someone's going to have to help me now. Women still feel that innate need to look after the family and fulfill all the needs that are expected of them. Another unique aspect of MS, one that I focus on specifically with my research in my clinic, is what we call invisible symptoms associated with MS. And again, Jenna referred to this as well. Those people who look like they don't have MS and yet have invisible disability. So this could be cognitive impairment, which is not the same as dementia. It's really more that difficulty with information processing speed or episodic memory. So as I tell my patients, you're still the same smart person you were before. It's just your MS has affected your cognition in certain ways. The other is fatigue. That's a really common symptom with people with MS, as well as some other things like neuropathic pain or bladder involvement. And of course, with childbearing, then you've got a dual hit when you think about bladder and bowel function. So a lot of these people, just as Jenna said, people will say, you don't look like you have MS, or their coworkers will be like, well, why do you get special accommodation and get to take specific breaks? And they don't understand that actually this is their MS. And in some ways it's a win. Like, I'm happy that you can't tell they have MS. It means that we're doing our best to keep our patients doing everything they want to do. But it does mean that they then face an extra stigma. So there is that expectation as a woman that you should be doing everything. And then on top of that, you have this invisible disability that people can't see and understand. So it's a lot of struggle for our patients with MS, dealing with the balances of being a woman and this unpredictable disease.
Absolutely. And that also ties back into what Jenna was saying with the fact that we need to normalize and actually have these discussions out in the open for people to be able to spot it. And so kind of carrying on with, you've mentioned some of the physical and cognitive aspects. Do you mind expanding on what some of those core cognitive and physical symptoms can look like and how they impact women with MS? And specifically, are there any misconceptions that women may face when planning for their future with regards to these physical and cognitive symptoms?
Absolutely. So the problem with MS is that you can't predict what someone's going to look like with their MS. I tell all my patients, your MS is not going to be the same as anyone else's MS. So some may have significant physical disability and yet have no cognitive impairment. On the flip side, someone may be suffering from significant fatigue and that's their only debilitating symptom. Others may have trouble with cognitive impairment, which I'll talk a bit more about. And yet you would see them walking down the street and not know they had MS. But it can lead to a lot of issues with gait, so your ability to mobilize, which can limit your ability to get to and from work or get to and from places of childcare. Sometimes that fatigue is so bad it's hard for persons with MS, to get their child to the bus stop and back. Or if you use a rollator walker, it's harder to navigate in the snow in the winter. So then it makes it even more difficult for you to provide that childcare. On top of that, there is, as I said, the cognitive impairment, which can lead to some stigma in that you may not remember things as well. You may not process information as quickly. And yet women are kind of known as being those multitaskers or those people who organize well. So we're less likely to admit that, oh, I forgot that, or, oh, could you please send that to me as an email because I'm not going to remember you told me, because these are just things that as women we're expected to have. One of the big misconceptions I think we have with MS, specifically in women, is the role of pregnancy and breastfeeding. So I'm sure that other people living with neurological diseases can attest to this, that it wasn't that long ago that we told people with MS and other neurological diseases that you shouldn't have a child, that you shouldn't get pregnant, that being pregnant was harmful, and that you had to worry about whether you would be disabled and not be able to look after your child. To be honest, I tell my patients, if you want to have a child, if you want to have many children, then do it. We can support you with that. The evidence is now showing that pregnancy is actually protective against MS activity. So during pregnancy, many of our patients with MS are able to come off their medication because their disease is less active. On top of that, more recent data has shown that exclusive breastfeeding, that first 6 months of breastfeeding, is also protective against MS disease activity. And again, we often can keep our patients off their disease modifying therapies while they're breastfeeding because it's protective. So if anything, you want to have all the babies. I don't really mean it that way, but it does mean that it should not limit your family choices. You can choose not to have children. I think that's part of any woman's choice. Whether you want to have them or not is a personal choice. But I would always encourage my MS patients not to think MS is a reason they can't, because my job is to make sure I keep them doing as well as they can for the long term and managing them during their pregnancy so they can do everything they want to do as if they didn't have MS. That's my goal.
Thank you so much. And hearing that, I'm sure is quite validating for women who do want to go through that journey. And I'm now going to bring in Lynn. Hello, Lynn, to this conversation. Now, Lynn, historically, the bulk of traumatic brain injury, or TBI, research and practice has focused on men. Can you discuss why this has been the case and what led you to focus on women's brain health instead?
Hello. Sure. I can say that as a woman who's living with a TBI, a traumatic brain injury myself, I came to the field of social work because I was looking to support others in their adjustment to life post-injury. It's what brings so many social workers into the field, this sort of wanting to take your own experience and use it to the better of other people who are following in your footsteps. So really, that's what drew me into social work and into the field of TBI at all. And as my interest and my professional focus on research grew, I didn't really expect that when I came in, but as that grew, I became aware of how sex and gender can alter the experience of TBI and make an already complex injury even more difficult to understand and support. And as well, as Lynn was speaking earlier in her message, traditionally, research and practice have both focused on male survivors of TBI, particularly sport-related injuries or car accidents. So our information currently is very much male-centered. And as fewer women were injured in these ways, overall, research is focused on male survivors, and support interventions that were built out of that research also are built on the male experience. And this led me, just out of sheer stubbornness perhaps, or curiosity, it led me to explore the experiences of women survivors in particular. And then through quite accidental pathways, it then led me to discover a specific group of women who are at very high risk of brain injury, but have traditionally been completely overlooked and underserved. And that's women exposed to risk of brain injury as a result of intimate partner violence. So we know that there are significant numbers of women around the world, 1 in 3. In some statistics, StatsCan recently put out statistics saying 4 in 10 here in Canada, women who will be exposed to intimate partner violence over their lifetime. We also know that in a physical assault, over 92% of those assaults will include hits to the head, face, or neck. And we also know that up to 75% of those women survivors are experiencing a probable brain injury as a result of that. So when we take all that math and put it together, based on the current statistics that we have, we know that approximately 1 in 8 Canadian women may have a brain injury as a result of exposure to intimate partner violence. And that statistic is equivalent to the breast cancer prevalence rates in this country. So we're talking about the same numbers of people who may be experiencing those conditions. But unlike breast cancer, this is an injury that is very likely to be undiagnosed, untreated, and quite possibly unknown to the survivor herself or her closest supporters. And like my fellow panelists have mentioned, this too is very much an invisible and hidden challenge. one of the reasons that I always lead with the fact that I have the experience of a brain injury and that I do live with it permanently is so that folks can see just what does that look like. Looking at me, listening to me speak, understanding the level of cognitive work that I do on a day-to-day basis, most people wouldn't have any sense that in fact I live with permanent challenges because of an injury. So what happened for me, I think, because this intersection has gone unnoticed for so long, we have very little available knowledge on it and next to no guidance for support professionals. And so I really focused my work on this intersection for the last 7 or 8 years in an effort to address this major gap in women's healthcare. I think it's really important that I agree with my panel members that we look at this from a sex and gender lens, that we understand how this happens and what are those social pressures that are involved. I was just listening, as Jenna spoke about that internalization process and thinking about the work that I'm doing right now and survivors talking about how they feel that they're stupid or that they're just not good enough. And those messages come both from inside themselves, but also from external sources of information. And I think that's one of the challenges that we really need to address as we move forward in this field.
Thank you so much for synthesizing that, Lynn, and for sharing your experiences as well. So we're now going to go to our audience questions. Thank you to everyone who has submitted one, and we'll try to get through as many as possible, as I mentioned. So the first one here bridges together the discussion that both Lynn and Sarah just had. And so this person asks, how might a healthcare provider recognize the differences between persistent post-concussive symptoms and multiple sclerosis? So can lingering concussion symptoms then turn into MS? And so, Sarah, I'm going to turn to you first on this.
Absolutely. And certainly some of those symptoms can be common between the two disorders. And there is some evidence, a study we did recently looking at Ontario claims data, that concussions in male adolescents, not females, but male adolescents increase the risk of MS at an adult age. So I'll rephrase that. I don't think I said it very well, but an adolescent concussion in a male, so less than age 16, increase the risk of them being diagnosed with MS in their 20s. So there is some link between the two. On top of that, post-concussive symptoms, so trouble with memory, concentration, processing information, all those symptoms that you can see with concussion, you can see with MS. The difference is that with MS, you don't have a triggering event. So you may not have had something that happened just before the onset of the symptoms like you would with concussion. Having said that, certainly I do see some of my concussion patients who get concussions. They happen. And sometimes it's hard to say how much of their symptoms were truly just concussion related versus it unmasking MS symptoms, or perhaps a combination of the two. Perhaps it was kind of a bit of 2 + 2 = 8 versus just 2 + 2 = 4 because they're already at risk with their MS. Regardless, my approach would be the same in terms of treatment approaches. So for me, at the end of the day, whether it's due from MS or concussion, we're going to address it because it's affecting their quality of life. We don't have anything that reverses the damage caused by MS. So we instead talk about behavioral techniques. But I can talk about that later. I think I've talked a little bit too much, and I'd love to hear what Lynn has to say.
Lynn, we'll turn it to you if you have anything else you'd like to add.
I think that's really interesting. I'd never thought about a link between brain injury, exposure to brain injury and concussive events and MS. One of the things that we talk about in the IPV brain injury field is the link to dementia or cognitive decline. That certainly is a known side effect from brain injury. We have increased rates of that later on in life. But one of the challenges we have with that sort of shared diagnosis piece is around PTSD and post-traumatic stress disorder. Those two conditions can look very much like each other and make it very difficult to tease them apart. So very similar to what Dr. Moore was talking about, it's that sort of, well, which happened first, and what symptoms do we attribute to which condition, and how do we support and treat which condition, and how does that interact with each other? And I think those are the pieces that are really interesting to tease apart. I think it's a great question, and boy, it's going to have me hitting the research really fast.
And this is why we have these talks, right? Stimulate more discussions and potential research opportunities as well here. So I'm now going to turn back to Jenna, and a theme that we're seeing in some of the questions that we're getting here is advocacy and self-advocacy for one. And Jenna, you have advocated for better workplace inclusion and have been involved in a number of initiatives over the years that have highlighted the active role employers should take to support persons with disabilities within their workforce, and the importance of brain health to that conversation. So can you tell us a little bit more about why involving employers is a necessary step? And from your experience, what have you learned about the ingredients it takes to make such a fundamental and long-term culture change?
That's a really good question. It's really critical to involve employers because companies and brands of all sizes have a lot of power to influence the dialogue that we hear publicly, and have the ability to sway how people might feel about an opinion one way or another. And the other reason is because we vote with our wallets, frankly, and the companies that we support and the brands that we support are a reflection of our core values, and likewise, if we align with the values of that company. And for that company to be fully inclusive, fully accommodating, persons with disabilities and recognition of the intersectionality of disabilities with things like brain health, mental health is really, really important. When an employer starts to examine its own policies internally, and say, hey, we could really improve the accommodation policies and guidelines for persons with disabilities, that really sets a precedent for other companies to follow, and can help, again, to establish that dialogue publicly about why this is important. As far as ingredients it might take to succeed, something that I have noticed time and again is that the company has to be willing to change. And that's hard. That's not just change to get more sales. That's not just change to get more customers. It's really a change that is felt by everyone in the company and supported by everyone in the company. And a recognition that this makes your workplace a better workplace for people with disabilities. It makes it a more diverse workplace. And it makes it an easier place for those individuals to work. And the other ingredient I've noticed, in addition to the willingness to change, is people at all levels of the company have to buy in. Your CEO, your managers, your employees, everyone has to buy into it and believe that it is something that needs to change within your company and something that can be improved. You don't just put together new policies and apply them and the next day say, well, we're inclusive now, it's fine. This is a long-term change. It takes many, many years for companies to get to the point where their policies are adequate, I suppose. And it takes many more years of constantly reevaluating, reworking them, and reaching out to your employees and saying, is this working for you? So the work is never done, but that willingness to change has to be there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jenna. And so I'm seeing here in the chat as well from the questions that we're getting, people interested in understanding what are some supports that need to be taken into consideration for optimal brain health. And that leads me to a question that I had for you, Sarah, which are it's quite literally the same question, thinking along the same lines here. So what are some of the key supports that you find are essential for women that you have worked with? And so that they can have an optimal life in all their ecosystems at home, in their communities, in their workplace. So what works essentially?
Again, as I said before, it's very individual to the person, their disability, their symptoms, and of course their life, because we all do different things or have um, get meaning from different parts of our lives. So we really need to focus on what part is giving them the most meaning and ensuring that we can preserve that and that they can keep doing that part. I think Jenna brought up some really good points about employment, which is something we're working with that with the MS in the 21st century currently, looking at tools that we can develop from both a patient and a healthcare practitioner side that can help persons with MS, specifically women, talk to their employers about having MS, as well as helping healthcare practitioners talk to their patients and then also talk to employers about accommodation that might be needed. One of the things I try to emphasize with my patients is that we want to identify things early. We don't want to wait until it's a problem. We don't want to wait until you've had a bad reprimand at work or that you've had a bad review. We don't want to wait until your spouse is so frustrated because you're not able to remember to pick up the kids from soccer on Saturdays. We want to identify those issues early. So for me, the biggest thing is opening the dialogue and ensuring that they know they can talk to me about it and know that they can talk to our team about it. Because Lynn had said this as well, is often people feel that they're stupid and they're like, oh, it can't be from my MS. I'm just not good at my job anymore. I'm just not a good mom. And that's so not true. We would never expect someone who has a cane to take the stairs. They would take the elevator. So we just have to figure out the way that we can help them take the elevator for their cognitive impairment or their fatigue or their neuropathic pain. We just have to identify it for them and kind of help them navigate that with their family and their friends. So a lot of it ends up being education. So we try to educate their friends and family about what they can do. So I often will say little things like, if you don't remember, if you can't process the information that someone gives you verbally because you're focused on something else, so you can't process that information, start telling your spouse and your kids, great, write me a list, or great, send that to me in an email, or great, send it to me in a text. And you start to get into the habit that they'll start doing it without you even having to ask it, that it just becomes second nature, that they accommodate those issues you're having, or explain it to them. I can't concentrate on what you're saying because I'm focused on cooking dinner. So please keep your permission slips till after dinner and I'll look at them, so that you're still able to do everything. We just have to find a system that works the best for you. So we do the same thing with work. Is it that you have bladder urgency? So can we get you your desk close to the bathroom so that you don't need to worry about going a far distance? If you have fatigue, let's get you a disability parking spot. Why? Just because you're not using a cane doesn't mean you're not fatigued by the time you walk all the way from the back of the parking lot to your desk. So let's find ways that we can bring you to your best potential and keep you doing the things that you want to do.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And kind of continuing along this line here, Lynn, you've mentioned that social integration after TBI is a huge element for ensuring women's quality of life, but oftentimes that rehabilitation and support for women has focused on socially constructed gender roles. So, for instance, groceries as opposed to, going to go get groceries as opposed to going back to work. So can you briefly discuss what key changes you'd like to see to empower women with TBI to live independently?
Sure. I think, and this kind of goes back to what Lynn was talking about in the very beginning about rats in basic science and the fact that we, for decades, for centuries, we've been using male rats because female rats have hormones and that complicates things. I think the first step here is even to be aware that the experience of traumatic brain injury can be very different for men and males as opposed to women and females. Healthcare providers, rehabilitation professionals, and supporters and caregivers all need to be aware of how sex and gender can influence a survivor's life post-injury. Following from that, you mentioned employment, and we've been talking about that here as well, and a lot of my work focuses on that too. Particularly for the women that I serve who've been exposed to IPV and have brain injury as a result of that, employment is incredibly important. For these women, it's a crucially important pathway to financial independence and safety. not to mention a key source of self-determination and self-identity. We need more service providers in both the IPV and the TBI sectors to become more aware of the intricate needs of women survivors and to develop better support structures for them. We need to listen to survivors. This was something, it's amazing, you know, when I thought about these answers and wrote these points out, I did not talk to my co-panelists here, and yet both of them have said little pieces in their own discussions about either their lived experience or what their research has shown that directly feeds back into what I'm talking about here. This idea of we need to listen to survivors, really listen to them and include them in all aspects of research and practice. If we ask women what they're experiencing and we believe them when they tell us, instead of dismissing their concerns as being overly emotional or attention seeking, and then we use that information to start building supports that are sex and gender sensitive, including educating professionals within their training programs, I think we would quickly notice an improvement in their capacity to live independent lives. And we need role models. As a woman with a TBI who's working in an academic capacity, I have very little expectation of ever holding a full-time faculty position. I've never met another person like me in that position, so I have no reason to believe that they exist. Part of the reason for that is that we don't support students in the lower levels adequately so that they can succeed in higher stages of study. We measure success by output, and those standards and measures are all built on assumptions of ability that do not include folks like me. I think we need to rethink the way we value output and think about a broader definition of skills and knowledge and the contributions that differently abled folks can make to our workplaces and our societies.
Thank you, Lynn. And we have a question here from an audience member, and I think it would be helpful to continue on with what you're talking about. So they've disclosed here that I'm recovering from many years of abuse and violence, and not once has any healthcare professional questioned if I might have a brain injury. Today, there are things I just can't do, and I'm wondering if a concussion can go undiagnosed. So do you mind responding to this person who's asked this question? Thank you, Lynn.
Absolutely. And first, let me say I'm sorry that you have experienced that in your life. And thank you for having the courage to ask the question here today so that others can learn as well. Absolutely, it can be an undiagnosed impact from exposure to violence. This has been completely overlooked in the healthcare field as well as the support fields for decades. It's only in the last 5 to 10 years that we've really even begun to understand that the intersection exists. So frontline workers, first responders, folks in the ER, no one has been looking at this particular group and saying, wait a minute, that exposure to the violence could be having an impact in terms of a brain injury. So the conversation itself has not been happening. We also know that for so many survivors of intimate partner violence, people just don't ask. So questions aren't asked about implications like a brain injury. We look at damage to faces and cuts and bruises and broken bones, but we don't think about what's behind and what's underneath the surface. So I would encourage anyone who has experienced any kind of injury to the head, face, or neck to consider that as a possibility and to seek out medical information. Things can be done to support folks many, many years post-injury. And I think it's important that folks understand that.
Thank you, Lynn. And we're also here getting questions from different audience members about, and Lynn, you touch on the intersectionality about having more than one brain disorder. So, a concussion doesn't just happen in and of itself or as one entity without other brain disorders occurring in some cases as well, which we don't often talk about. And so one question here that has highlighted this quite saliently is this person asks, how can neurodiverse people with more than one brain disorder, so autism spectrum disorder and concussion, for instance, ensure that they are receiving the right treatment and care? Sometimes as an autistic person, the symptoms I experienced after receiving a concussion diagnosis were dismissed, even though I said that they were not my normal. So maybe Sarah, I can turn to you to start us off with tackling this quite large question here.
It is a large question, but I think what the person asking the question said is the most important thing. Is it your normal? If it's not, then there's something going on. And that's something we talk about a lot in my MS cognitive clinic, in that one of the things we started doing was doing testing at the time of diagnosis. So we had an idea of how they were doing at that time, kind of an idea of, so we have a comparison. Not that I had any concerns about their cognition, but just so we had like a snapshot in time. Because people will come to us and say, I'm not doing as well as I used to. But if you tested them at that time, they might fall on the bell curve and be normal. So they're still normal, but they're right, it's not their normal. So that ability to track changes over time has really helped us in our clinic validate what our women with MS are feeling. Of course, I would have believed them before, but sometimes having that hard evidence helps them. They say, oh, I'm not going crazy. And I'm like, no, you're not. It's your MS. And now that we have this, let's deal with it. Or if they perceive they're not doing as well, but perhaps their cognitive tests aren't showing any change, then what else is going on that's making them feel they're not cognitively doing well? Is it that they're not sleeping well? Is there something else going on? Is there some stressor? Are they being distracted by something else? So for me, no matter what, if someone says it's not their normal, it means that something's going on and we need to explore. Is it MS? Is it something else that could be happening? As you were saying earlier, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. Unfortunately, people with MS have other comorbidities, other medical conditions, and we can't just think of them in this MS silo and think that nothing else is going to happen to them and that they don't intersect. So just for me, hearing that this is not my normal means we need to look into it and figure out what it might be.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And Jenna and Lynn, if you feel free to hop in here if you have any other insights that you want to share before I move on to the next question. Okay, I will move on to the next question. And so one person here asks, how important is the nutrition of the brain in these specific epilepsy, concussion, MS? And so of course we heard this being part of the 6 pillars. And Jenna, earlier on, you had mentioned that you didn't necessarily know this at the very beginning. Can you maybe start us off with the importance of nutrition and just needing to have access to that information?
Nutrition for me, for my epilepsy, has been critically important to being able to manage it properly. When I was younger, I did not have that information. And also being new to university, not a lot of access to stuff outside of fast food, it really became a secondary thought in terms of what I had to do to manage my epilepsy. And I'm sure it's the same for a lot of people. Diet really does have a great impact on our energy levels, our mental health, and a lot of other ways that we might need to plan our day. And having more education, I think, about that, especially for individuals with respect to brain health with disability, is really important.
Thank you. And would anyone else like to join in here, or before I move on to the next question?
On this one, I'd like to just have a quick comment, and that is that it was really interesting for me when I was watching those 6 pillars come up. And what I was thinking about was how few of them the women that I serve have access to, and how important that is, and that means for them moving forward in their lives.
Thank you. And Lynn, actually, this question, I'll see I'm going to throw this to you. So several years ago, this our audience member has written, I had a concussion, and even now I feel the after effects. What is the long-term impact of TBI, and how do I advocate for the right treatment and care? And something that struck me in our conversations is that oftentimes health professionals might not have the up-to-date information of the treatment, the best treatment for this day and age. So do you mind walking us through that? And yeah.
I think that's one of the things that I find as a researcher and a professional, as a social worker. It's one of the things I find the most difficult is that we don't have a standard of care across this country. So it really, the answer to your question really, in many ways, is tied to where you live. If you live in a major urban center here in southwestern Ontario, you have access to care that is beyond comparison to what somebody in PEI might have, or in Northern Ontario. We don't even need to leave the province to see that kind of distinction. And that's incredibly frustrating. So I think it's really, if you want to get into an advocacy role, that's the first thing you can start advocating for is better service, better access to better services across the province and across the country. In terms of the long-term effects, I think one of the things that, as a survivor of brain injury, one of the things that I think about is accommodation. So I think whether or not I can fix the wires in my brain is kind of not the point 20 years post-injury. For me, it's a question of how do I learn to do the best that I can do in the circumstances that I'm in, and how do I avoid those things that trigger me? So if I'm looking at self-care at home, I'm looking at what are the things that really make my life difficult. Lack of sleep, lack of exercise, not having access to good meals, all those 6 pillars, right? So if those are the pillars that are going to make me feel better, how do I get access to them? Even if I'm challenged by that, what are the ways in which I might do it? And I have to say that just listening to Dr. Morrow talk about her goals as a healthcare provider and thinking, boy, how can I steal you to come work in my field? How can I make it so that we have folks who are looking at how to support you living your best life? And I think that's a healthier approach to living with a chronic challenge of any nature, but certainly living with the impacts, long-term impacts of a brain injury. How do you go about living your best life? Not how do you get back to where you were pre-injury status?
Absolutely. And also kind of as the theme, the theme that cuts across all three of you is talking about knowing what your baseline is, knowing what your normal is. And so we have a question here kind of clarifying, like, what should I pay attention to about my body during these high risk ages, going back to onset of MS here, Sarah? What are kind of signals that women can be looking for that might signify something is wrong?
That is a very timely and complicated question. Right now, there's a lot of research, not mine, but here in Canada, which is very exciting, looking at what is called the prodrome of MS. So 2 researchers in Canada, one in BC and now another in Manitoba, have taken a deep dive into this and looked at interactions with the healthcare system in the 5 years leading up to their MS diagnosis. And those, when they matched them to people who did not have MS or had other medical issues that were not neurological and not MS, they found that there was a 3 times increase in the number of interactions with the healthcare system in those 5 years leading up to an MS diagnosis. So that time when they had frank symptoms that said, this is MS. And that makes it difficult. So knowing what to identify as something's going on versus the something's going on as MS is very difficult, in the sense that, as I was saying earlier, MS is variable. It's different by every person. It depends on where in the brain or spinal cord or optic nerve it manifests itself its first time. It is really often a clinically silent disease until something frank happens. And that's something that we as researchers are working on. I think for me, whether it's MS or something else, thinking about symptoms that are coming on and not going away. Because from a brain injury point of view, and you can think of MS as a brain injury, it's just not from a concussive injury, but it's your brain being damaged by your own immune system. Those symptoms are not going to be fleeting. They're not going to come and go. So if you're having neurological symptoms that are coming on and not going away, or even if you're having non-specific symptoms that you can't pinpoint to one thing, like fatigue. Fatigue could be from anemia, it could be from heavy menstrual periods, it could be from MS, it could be because you're breastfeeding and you aren't sleeping at night. There's all sorts of reasons, but if something's going on and persisting, having it evaluated, and whether it's MS or not, is the most important thing in my mind. And as I think everyone else here has said, if it's something you're worried about, say it out loud so that it's on the radar of your healthcare professional. Even if you're like, oh, I think it might be MS, it doesn't make any sense, but I feel like it is. Voicing that concern to your healthcare practitioner will help them kind of understand what you're going through and hopefully either order the appropriate tests to either rule it in or rule it out, and identify what's going on as early as possible to, as one of the other panelists says, live your best life.
And at the end of the day, you are the expert in your own body. You
Exactly.
know you're normal. Thank you so much, Sarah. So with that, I mean, we're almost done. I wish we can continue on, but we want to leave all three of our incredible guests with the last word. So to each of our panelists, what would you like the audience to take away from this conversation? And Jenna, I'm going to start with you.
It's hard to summarize it, I think. My takeaway would be that we need to listen to women and believe what they're saying, and whether that be in a healthcare setting or a friend coming to you and disclosing maybe they're struggling with their epilepsy or another invisible or non-visible disability, believing them and believing their experience is the takeaway that I would leave you.
Thank you. And Lynn, pass it off to you.
I'm really greedy. I had to narrow it down to three things. I'd like us all to think about IPV as a healthcare issue instead of a social one. I think we desperately need to change the way that we approach this issue in order to destigmatize it and create pathways to appropriate care. And for the folks who are here today, just talk about it. If we bring it out of the darkness, we have a chance of giving women survivors the kind of support they need to live healthy and meaningful lives. And last, for anybody out there who thinks they may have a TBI or know they have a TBI or is just dealing with someone with new circumstances, I want people to know that there is life after TBI. No matter how or when you received your injury, there is hope. Many people experience improvements years post-injury. What we do now to support survivors does matter, and it can make a positive difference.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And Sarah, we'll end with you. Thanks.
Thanks. So I think for me is understanding that women with MS have a unique experience and need to be viewed as distinct. Their experience is distinct from men living with MS. Women with MS have to think about, do I bring a child into this world? What is it going to mean to my life? How is that going to affect my MS? How is my MS going to affect my child? How is the choice I make about breastfeeding, going on disease-modifying therapy now or delaying it? And realizing that they also have all the other unique experiences, which we talked about with hormones, which we didn't even get into tonight, but the different effects that women have with hormonal changes, both through prepubescence, through puberty, through menopause. Aging with MS is a whole other thing. And that's not something that men need to think about or plan. Similarly, think about the gender roles and how that influences our care. Women are expected, even in this day and age where things are getting better, to provide the health care and look after the home, and yet still want to work or need to work sometimes outside of the home. So we need to support our women with MS in a unique way to ensure that we're not forgetting about the fact that they have a different role in society than men, and how can we support them in their MS in that unique way?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Sarah. And I think that speaks to all of the neurological conditions that we spoke about today. So thank you. From everyone at the Ontario Brain Institute, I want to thank each of our panelists, Sarah, Lynn, Jenna, for sharing their expertise and their experiences with us today. And to a reminder that these voices represented tonight are one of many, and we need to acknowledge the diversity of experiences women have navigating brain health, which are tethered to multiple factors like race and socioeconomic status. So moving forward, we need our discussions to reflect this intersectional identities and include these voices, particularly racialized women, trans women, women who have been the most marginalized in society. And with that, I want to thank you as well, the audience, for engaging with us in this talk tonight. We have some resources to share with you for more information around this topic. We will post them on the screen shortly, and for a complete list is also available on the OBI website. And your feedback is so valuable to us. We have a survey link in the chat box, so please share your thoughts with us on tonight's talk. OBI public talks are designed to share the latest knowledge on brain health and to offer simple tips to manage both health and wellness. And OBI's current set of public talks is called Your Brain Health. This series explores topics suggested by you, our audience, through these feedback surveys. So stay tuned for the last talk in this series, Precision Medicine, in the spring. And so to sign up for the next talk, you'll find a link in the chat box or on our website. So with that, thank you and have a great evening.